This is the goal of the entire administrative state concept, which is to take all real power away from true government, that is the people themselves, and put it into institutions which are not subject to popular control.
Here at Liberty and Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by the inventory, ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're always honored to have this returning guest. Dr. Edwin Vieira is a constitutional attorney. He specializes in many areas of constitutional law and has argued cases up to and including the United States Supreme Court. He's written extensively on the origins of sound money, and he speaks widely on the principles surrounding the Second Amendment and the value of states reclaiming their rights to maintain state militia and the involvement of ordinary people as we the people, we the government of our own states and of the militia that is to enforce and to execute the laws of the states. That a lot of that has been lost, and we're just grateful for you coming back on today, Dr. Vieira. Thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we still have the opportunity to talk about these things.
That's true. We don't know how long that will last, and so we're taking advantage of it while we can. And on that note, just for people to be aware of that there are multiple platforms that they can find us, and that may be necessary at some point in the future. So look in the description of this video and keep an eye on us from all of our platforms. The issue we want to talk with you about today, and you consented to come on and address with us, is one that is a very current concern, because this week it is being discussed at international levels whether the World Health Organization should be granted by countries around the world the ability to bring forth binding recommendations, I think they're calling them, basically guidelines that countries would be subject to following, and in a sense, one might argue voluntarily surrendering some of their sovereignty to a unelected, unaccountable, for many people, faceless, invisible, global organization. And I had we'll put in the link in a link in the description of this video to various petitions which are being circulated. One of them from the Family Research Council, others as well, asking people to contact their congressmen, contact their senators, and let them know what you think about us agreeing as a country or as a United States to surrendering some of our sovereignty to a global organization in the name of, in this case, I guess it's public health. They're saying they're preparing for more crises to come, and how we'll deal with those is being proposed to include countries handing over portions of their sovereignty and their self-determination to this global body. It's of grave concern to those of us who are champions for liberty and freedom and the rights of the people to manage their own affairs. So we wanted to talk with you, Dr. Vieira, about what this means to us as Americans. And first of all, can you just give us a clue for those who have not heard about this issue that's being discussed right now, what the scope of it actually is, what the actual proposal is?
Well, they are talking about something that is slightly below the level of a treaty. It's the international health regulations that already exist. I think they came up in, 2005. And they are really the foundation for this whole concept of the ability of the World Health Organizations to declare pandemics and then to put out, you say guidelines, I would call them more along the lines of directives as to how various countries are supposed to handle these situations. And obviously the ultimate point is to focus control over public health, using those terms in a kind of vague sense, in a centralized one world United Nations type operation centered in the World Health Organization. So what they're coming up with now, or what they're looking at now, are amendments to several sections of one of the articles of this international health treaty, or health regulations, really. And that will be concerned with public health emergencies of international concern, of regional concern, or what they call intermediate health alerts. Now, what this does is the changes they're trying to put in. First, they want to be able to adopt their regulations more quickly now than in the past. I think the difference is 18 months to 6 months, whatever it is. They want to make it easier and quicker to change these regulations. Then they want to set up something they're calling a compliance committee. I say when you use the word compliance, you're no longer talking about guidelines, are you? You're talking about something that's a little bit stricter than suggestions. And this committee will be composed, obviously, of experts. We always get back to the experts, who will judge how well various countries are following the international health regulations. All right, so we're looking at oversight, surveillance, if you will, a surveillance mechanism. And then they want to be able to declare public health incidents, which are based not simply on actual emergencies, and of course emergency is a pretty elastic term, but on potential emergencies. So now you have verbal silly putty to the second power, right? And who will, of course, determine this? Well, it will be the compliance committee of the experts. And then they want to set up an emergency committee, which, of course, ties into this public health emergency concept. And this committee would include representatives not only from a particularly affected country, not only the country in which the supposed public health emergency actually exists or potentially exists, but there would be representatives from other countries. So these other countries in which supposedly the emergency did not exist would have some say or insight, or however you want to put it, into how these public health regulations would be applied in the country that does have, supposedly, the public health emergency. And then other countries would be given the power to report, that's the term they use, to report on supposed public health emergencies in some different country that might cause a pandemic to be declared. So let's take it as an example. There's some concern about monkeypox in Belgium, I think it is, so they've gone to the extent of declaring quarantines or whatever, more overreach. I mean, monkeypox has been around for God knows how long, hundreds of years, right? In any event, apparently Sri Lanka could now, under these new regulations, report on the health emergency in Belgium, and that might cause the emergency committee or the compliance committee to take action against Belgium on the strength of a report made by some third party, fourth party, fifth party, whatever it is. So this opens up a tremendous area for one country to interfere in the internal affairs of another through the World Health Organization's international health regulations. And one could say, well, then it's being set up for the major countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, whatever, maybe China, to use this mechanism to interfere in lesser countries, countries with lesser influence. But it could work the other way as well. So you could have conglomerations of countries, Islamic countries, for instance, saying that they're now going to complain about the health regulations in Germany because Germany has so many Islamic immigrants, right? You can see that the potential here for all sorts of international complications is extreme. And this, of course, takes us back to really the premise of all of this is the treaty concept. All right, the United Nations and all of the structures within the United Nations, World Health Organizations, their powers, such as they claim against individual countries, are predicated upon those countries having some sort of treaty with the United Nations. They're signatories to the United Nations, the original United Nations Charter, and they have some treaty obligation as a result of something that was done under their own domestic laws in these countries. And of course, that raises the point that you made, that raises the question of national sovereignty. To what extent do treaties undercut or override, let's put it that way, national sovereignty? Now, there's an interesting bit of history. You always have to look at the history of these things to see how they've developed and where the errors have come in. Back, I think it was in the Eisenhower administration, maybe in the early years even of the Truman, or later years of the Truman administration, before Eisenhower was elected, there was Senator Bricker, and he proposed something that was called the Bricker Amendment. And he was very concerned about the United Nations in particular. And his idea was, or his concern, his fear was, that for the United States to sign on by treaty to certain international organizational structures, the United Nations being the one at the time of consequence, was contrary to the U.S. Constitution in the sense that these treaty obligations would override constitutional provisions, so that the UN could come in and, say, nullify some of the Bill of Rights or nullify some of the powers of Congress or whatever. And the Bricker Amendment was proposed to deal with this. Essentially, it said, no, that can't happen. A treaty cannot override the Constitution. Now, that, to my mind, always was an extraordinarily dangerous idea that man put out. I mean, it was ignorance beyond belief, because he was accepting the proposition that a treaty with some kind of international organization could, in fact, override the Constitution. Now, that is not the law. It has never been the law. I mean, you can go back and find decisions of the Supreme Court in the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s, early part of the 20th century, on and on you go, that point out that although a treaty becomes a law within the United States, it is a law that is no higher, essentially, than a statute. No treaty can override the Constitution, just as no statute of the United States can override the Constitution. And in fact, Congress has the power by statute to override a treaty. So a treaty could be enacted in 2010, and in 2012, Congress comes along and passes a contrary statute. That's the end of the treaty. And the treaty might also require that some things be done. Appropriations, for instance, might have to be raised in order to pay for some of the provisions of the treaty to be enforced. If Congress didn't raise the money, too bad. The treaty would not be operative. Same thing if the president had to do something, or some agency in the federal government had to do something, and it wasn't done. Too bad for that. And the only recourse would be, well, some kind of protest from the other country or the UN or whatever, and there is no court, international court, that could enforce the treaty. The United States doesn't even recognize the International Criminal Court, right? So looking at it from that point of view, one would say, this we can laugh at these treaties. The difficulty is this concept of the expertise of the administrators, the ones in the World Health Organization, the ones who are on these compliance committees and emergency committees under the international health regulations, and the fact that they make claims to expertise in the public health field, or actually any field. And we've already seen this with the World Health Organization without these regulations, compliance regulations, how the World Health Organization was able to affect or interfere with operations of the public health bureaucrats in the United States, CDC, FDA at the state level, and so forth, who are already saying, well, we're listening to the World Health Organization. Not that we have to, but we are listening to them, all right? So obviously, if there's some kind of international health regulation that goes beyond simply saying, well, listen to us, but says you have to comply in some way with what we tell you, now we have the problem that our public health bureaucrats may say, well, we're going to do that. We're going to comply, even though we don't have to. And now we get into the problem of how are they subject to control? Clearly, the international bureaucrats are not subject to control. But how are our local public health officials, national, state, and local public health officials, who simply claim that they have the right or the duty to comply with these international health regulations, how are they going to be controlled? Now, we've already seen what happened under the COVID so-called pandemic, right? And you had Fauci and the others at that level, and you had people at the state level sending infected individuals into nursing homes to kill 15,000 of them. You had this at the local level with school lockdowns and every other thing that you can imagine, right? In which the public health officials were simply saying, well, we're going to do this without any concern for whether the executive branch of our government or the legislature has said this or that, or even the courts. I mean, Fauci was on the other day, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, saying, well, the courts shouldn't interfere in the determinations of the CDC and the FDA. An unbelievable position to take. Absolutely unbelievable. Right? If we had an honest government, the fellow would have been impeached the next morning just for saying that. Absolutely incredible that he would say that. But what if he said that at the next level? Not that the court shouldn't interfere with what he and his people are doing at the public health institutions in the United States, not just because the court shouldn't interfere with them, but because the court shouldn't interfere with this international organization and these international rules. Well, now we have it's raised to the next level of insulation from control by our own court system. So if you can say that the court system in the United States is not going to interfere with these, and we'll claim the courts may throw up their hands and say, well, we can't do this, we can't interfere with this, then you really have transferred sovereignty. The transfer may be illegal, but it's happened, right? As I say, in real time. So there's one of our difficulties. And if we look at the administrative law concept, and that's what this is, right? At the international level, we have the administrative agencies run by experts. What happened in the United States with this system, and it was set up to a large extent, actually it was set up before the Wilson administration, but the Wilson administration went full hog with it during World War I, and of course Roosevelt comes along and expands it terrifically during the Depression. It has been expanding ever since. These agencies were set up by Congress to be staffed with experts in various fields to promulgate regulations supposedly in consistency with and advancing some statute that Congress had the authority to pass. And then the agency would, one way or another, enforce these regulations. So it might be given some kind of quasi-judicial power or executive power or whatever. And the reason for it was that although Congress had the power to deal with certain areas in the economy or what have you, it couldn't really accomplish much because on a day-to-day basis, Congress was not capable of overseeing all of the problems that might arise. So it had to give general directives and then create an administrative agency that would, as the expression had it, fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps in the statute on the day-to-day basis by writing regulations. And of course, this thing, I always look at this as a classic power grab. These people knew what they were doing. That once Congress had passed this statute and the regulations were being written by the administrative agency and enforced by the administrative agencies, number one, Congress would not be in a position on a regular basis to review these regulations, especially when they became voluminous. Look at the Federal Code of Federal Regulations, how voluminous that is every day, not just every month and every year or every decade, but every day. Right? Congress cannot possibly oversee that. So this would give essentially autonomy in the generation of regulations to the agency, and that would be autonomy to the experts in the agency, because the agencies supposedly were staffed by experts in various fields. And then if you looked at the other side of the control mechanism, which would be the judiciary, well, the judiciary is going to hear very few cases and controversies coming out of these agencies simply because it takes someone to bring a case or controversy. And they need lawyers, and they have to pay money, and so forth. And they're against the full panoply of financial power and legal power of the government of the United States. So you'd have few and far between would be the ability for judicial review, as the term is used. And then when it came to the courts very early on, these courts were products of appointments by Franklin Roosevelt. So they were not only that, because they come out of the law schools and had been judges earlier, in which this concept of agency deference had taken root and was taught. And the concept there was, well, these agencies are being created in order to have expert control over these highly complicated areas of human existence, social existence, economic existence. And the courts are not really in a position to second guess these experts. The courts are not made up of experts on securities or experts on public health or whatever it may be, right? And so they have to give deference to what the agencies have done in the terms of the regulations they've written. And if there's some kind of reasonable base, some reasonable belief that this is in consonance with the statute, well, then they have to accept what the agency has done. A lot of people call this the Chevron standard because there was a famous case involving Chevron oil a few years ago in which this was really laid out. But it goes all the way back to the 1930s and early 40s when these agencies were developed. Right? So you have no review as a practical matter at the level of Congress because Congress simply doesn't have the ability to stick its nose into all these things the agencies are doing. And you have very little review at the judicial level because very few cases are going to be brought. And when they are brought, the agencies say, well, we're entitled to deference because we're the experts and you're just a bunch of morons, you judges. And the judges are perfectly willing to say, yeah, that's right, we'll go along with that. Either because ideologically they like the idea of the administrative state or they don't want to get bogged down in fantastically complicated litigation or whatever. There are all sorts of reasons. They don't want not to be invited to Georgetown cocktail parties, right, because they're attacking some agency that the great mass media love. So we have that problem. And here in this country, we have that problem. And we've seen how it's developed. But there have been limitations in the past because the agencies all have operated in pretty much separate domains. Securities and Exchange Commission, what's it dealing with? Well, it's dealing with the markets, right? Wall Street, securities, the selling of securities. Right? You have the Interstate Commerce Commission, by hypothesis, that is dealing with regulations, dealing with interstate commerce. And if you look at the big trucks, when they're parked in the gasoline station or whatever, they will have some ICC license number on them, right? Because it's regulated that kind of activity. So, and the Federal Reserve is another classic example. What's it regulating? Interest rates, bank reserves, right? A monetary policy of one kind or another. It's an administrative agency of a peculiar kind because it's really a big cartel. But in any event, these were designed to handle separate fields where expertise of peculiar kinds were necessary, all right? And therefore, there was a certain kind of limitation that was built into their operations. The SEC probably could not expand its authority very easily into the area of the ICC or into the area of the Federal Reserve or what have you, into the area of the Department of Homeland Security, right? Mainly because its expertise didn't have, as it were, a colorable basis for that expansion, but also because the other agency into which it was trying to expand would try to protect its own turf. So there would be competition between agencies and, if you will, kind of a self-defense mechanism built into it. But what have we learned now from the COVID pandemic operation? We've learned now that one of those agency areas, the public health agency area, which involves more than one agency, FDC, CDC, et cetera, both at the national and the state level, that those people claim the ability not only to deal with medical questions and public health questions of that sort, but to deal with social, economic, cultural, political controls. Right? They've gotten to the point, well, the lockdown is a classic example of that. We're going to claim the ability to cause lockdowns to happen, and those will, of course, have tremendous social, economic, and even political effects. And too bad for you, right? We're going to exercise power that has all of those effects, and there's nothing you can do about it because we're calling it a public health emergency, right? Now, if the SEC tried to pull that kind of a stuff, well, we're going to have lockdowns because we're afraid people shouldn't be listening to shut down the media because people shouldn't be listening to what's happening in Wall Street. Everyone would laugh at them, right? Say, well, this is completely out of your domain, right? And the courts would shut them down like 5 seconds after they issued this dictate. But what we've seen is when you can terrorize people with the fear of imminent death, so they created this terror campaign, mental terror campaign, and justified or rationalized the ability of a very small group of public health quote-unquote experts to expand their power into areas that have nothing whatsoever to do with public health. So it was all over the map. It wasn't simply medical public health decisions that they were making or effects that their decisions were having. They were economic, they were social, they were even political, and certainly they were cultural. There's a whole culture now that has been developed around this, right? And you have the country split on mask wearing or social distancing or taking vaccines or not taking vaccines. On and on we go. And all of this was the accomplishment, if you will, of a very small group of people in Washington who could have, this is the important thing, who could have been controlled by every branch of the national government, and at the state level could have been controlled by the state governments. I mean, the state governments could simply have told their public officials, don't listen to Fauci. That would have been the end of it. But it didn't happen. All right. So we see the great danger of this public health umbrella being put over the powers of these agencies, and how that public health umbrella can cover all sorts of manipulations, controls, interventions, whatever kinds of words you want to use, that will have effects far beyond public health. Now, in the United States, at least, as I say, a treaty cannot override the Constitution. And a treaty cannot override the domestic powers of Congress or the president. So, as I said, Congress could pass a statute that is inconsistent with the treaty. Too bad for the treaty. The president might take some actions that were inconsistent with the treaty, such as refusing to do things in the executive branch. Too bad for the treaty. I mean, other countries might yell and scream, but there's nothing they could necessarily do about it. However, and here's the big however nationally in this country, a treaty is at the level of a statute of Congress. So pursuant to the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2, state law has to yield to the terms of a treaty. So if you had a treaty dealing with, let's say, migratory birds, the migratory birds, geese or ducks or whatever they are, could not be hunted except pursuant to certain regulations, in conformity with certain regulations. And these regulations were inconsistent with the fish and game laws of a particular state. The fish and game laws would have to yield to the terms of the treaty. And so that's one of the problems with treaties, is that if Congress, the executive branch, and the courts, the national level, for whatever ideological reason, are willing to go along with some treaty that has questionable effects constitutionally, there's no direct protection that the states have. The states can't simply say no. I mean, they might have to go back to Congress, they might have to go back to the federal courts or whatever, but they can't, on the basis of their own laws, necessarily say no. Well, what this international health regulation operation is going to do is it's going to try to do at least the same thing at the national level. Now, obviously, all these international health regulations will have the same effect if they're coming through a treaty mechanism on the states. But the goal of the World Health Organization, of the United Nations, and of course the people behind the United Nations, because that's the key to the whole business, people behind the United Nations, is to overcome the label of public health, to overcome the ability of nations to control all of these aspects of their domestic policies that can be claimed to have some relationship to public health responses to quote-unquote pandemics and quote-unquote public health emergencies. Even a president that wanted to do it would probably have something of a hard time squelching the World Health Organization and these international health regulatory committees when their pronouncements on pandemics or other kinds of public health so-called emergencies were now being fed into the United States by the international mass media. And you're going to generate hysteria, right? Oh, well, we have to follow the World Health Organization because otherwise we're all going to die. So you tell me where this can lead. Well, it can lead to a greater level of chaos than occurred with the Fauci operation and the COVID flu, the Wuhan flu, right? Plus, if we had any sense, I mean, people would be for removing Fauci and the rest of those people from office as quickly as possible. You can't remove the people in the World Health Organization or the people on these international health committees. You might have a representative for the United States on one of these committees, but that would be it. Right? What would be the only way to get out from under it? I think probably the only way to get out from under it would be to leave the United Nations in the long run. Probably they've got this thing so tied up that as long as the United Nations membership exists, that member country is going to be subject one way or another to the dictates of these various United Nations subunits. And so you have to leave it entirely. Well, now we're going to have a great international brouhaha, aren't we? Right? That's where the United States should leave the United Nations. Whether it can leave I can imagine them saying that. It'll be like secession in 1860, right? Whether that's legal or not. You can imagine what the international community, the Davos groups, will say if any president came forward that, well, we're going to leave the United Nations, or I as president, no longer going to accede to these directives coming out of the United Nations. You can imagine what would happen, right? So this is the difficulty. And the fear I see of this is that whoever they are in the background, in control, will be able to use what I would call the Fauci scenario to impose who knows what kind of controls on the United States. Right? You look at what he did, and all the little dictators all the way down into the states and sometimes the localities. Look at what they were able to accomplish in terms of setting up really totalitarian control. The courts didn't stop them. The executive branch didn't stop them. The legislatures didn't stop them. Nobody stopped them. All the bad effects can't be reversed. And whom are you going to sue? Who was that poor guy running a delicatessen that was destroyed economically? His business was ruined because of a lockdown in Decatur, Illinois. Who is he going to sue? What lawyer is going to take that case? Well, the answer is no. No lawyer is going to take that case because there's not enough money coming back. First place, do you win it? You're going to go on for 5 years, 10 years. You're going to have to call experts. How much are the experts going to charge you? Think of what a case like that would cost in comparison to what you might get back. What was the value of that delicatessen? Certainly not $4 or $5 million, probably, which is what the case would probably cost. So you think of the tremendous uncompensated harm that has been caused simply by a few totalitarian-minded bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Now, as you go to these higher levels, it becomes worse because Fauci at least could look around and say, well, there are people that can do something to me. I could be impeached. I could be removed. I could be indicted. God knows what could happen here in the United States. What's going to happen to the people on one of these international public health committees? Well, nothing. Nobody can do anything to them. They may not have obviously they probably have some kind of legal immunity serving on international boards or committees. But they certainly have absolute practical immunity. Nothing is going to happen to them. Even if they didn't have legal immunity, no one's going to be able to get at them. So they can say any fool thing they want. They can pass that on to the public health bureaucrats in a particular country. And if those public health bureaucrats want to use those powers for their own purposes of, let's say, personal aggrandizement. I'm going to be a big shot, right? I'm a narcissistic psychopath. That's why I'm in this position. And I'm not going to use this power that they've given me. I can say, well, my hands are tied. World Health Organization told me I have to do this, and we're going to have lockdowns, right? And there you go. And now what are our courts going to do? How long is it going to take to sue this guy when the real party in interest is the World Health Organization? This guy's defense as well as the World Health Organization. Oh, goodness gracious, this treaty together. Think how complicated that litigation will be. See, the point is that some of these things that should have been stopped at the beginning, right? Way back, When Wilson started to do that, probably a little bit before Wilson, because you had the Department of Agriculture and so on. These things were developing, these concepts were developing, right? But it was at the turn of the 20th century when this concept of administrative law came to the fore, certainly in the law schools or among the leading political thinkers, right? And the Wilson put it in. He had the opportunity to put it in big time because of World War I. Set up a lot of administrative agencies to run the war economy. Bernard Baruch, remember, this was the kingpin of it all. Right? He had one man that was running this. And then Roosevelt expanded it. It's expanded ever since, for one reason or another. Once the UN came in, well, now there was this external force. It was bad enough that it was being done in Congress, but now we had this external force working through the United Nations and the treaty, so-called treaty obligations with the United States, that was going to impose new restrictions, new controls, without really any way to get at it, because you had moved the level of competence, if you will, the level of authority outside of the United States, and therefore you had to take really serious steps to cut back on that. As I said, the ultimate serious step is get out of the United Nations. And that was why I think way back with Wilson, what was the first step that was done by the people that were thinking in the direction of international control, destroying national sovereignty? The League of Nations, right? That was the first step here. Thought of, by the way, before the Versailles Treaty was negotiated. Well, it wasn't negotiated, it was imposed on the Germans, right? They were already thinking about this. They were already talking about the League of Nations before the League of Nations ever came into existence. Somebody was already had this plan in mind. They set up the League of Nations, and what happened? The Senate of the United States looked at this and said, no. Henry Cabot Lodge, wasn't it? The original Lodge, right, was a leader of that. The concept that, no, we're not going to get involved in this thing, because they could see what the effects would ultimately be. The claimed effects. See, I keep coming back to this, the claimed effects. A treaty cannot override the sovereignty of the United States. A treaty cannot override the Constitution of the United States. But we have people in this country, very large numbers of people, and I don't talk about the average man in the street, he wouldn't know from a hole in the wall, but in the political area, right, whether they're politicians or political thinkers or law school people or whatever, who say, oh, yes, it can. And we had that experience, as I said before earlier, during, I think it was Eisenhower administration with Bricker, Senator Bricker. It was a senator of the United States who honestly, I'm going to assume he honestly believed, I'm going to assume he wasn't a Trojan horse, that he honestly believed that a treaty could override the Constitution of the United States, notwithstanding that you can find decisions of the Supreme Court. I mean, I'm looking at one right here. Doe versus Braden, 1853. The Cherokee Tobacco, 1871. Holden versus Joy, 1872. I mean, you can go back and find these decisions without any grave difficulty. But apparently no one pointed it out to him. So he deceived himself, or maybe his staff people deceived him or whatever. But he was operating on a false premise. And he created, and you hear this all the time from people who have looked into this in a superficial way. Oh, well, remember, the Bricker Amendment wouldn't have been a good idea if the Bricker Amendment had been passed, because then we wouldn't have this problem. I say we didn't need the Bricker Amendment. But vast numbers of people, two vast numbers of people believe, oh, yeah, treaties override the Constitution, and that's the end of it. So if they get this thing in, no matter what it says, no matter what it claims to do, because we are the United States, signatories to the UN Charter, that we have to follow this like lapdogs in the same way that we followed what was coming out of Fauci. And the answer was we didn't have to follow what was coming out of Fauci, but a lot of people went along with it for political reasons. They liked the idea, right? They're totalitarians, so this was a good idea. There were the Bill Gates type people who had this agenda, vaccinate the world for whatever ultimate purpose. Right? We had just the totalitarians said, oh, this is an opportunity for me to exercise totalitarian power. Why not? I'm a narcissistic psychopath. This is what I want to do. So I'm going to do it. And all these people came out of the woodwork. It was amazing how fast they came out of the woodwork. We had perhaps never realized how many of these people there were at every level of the government, the national government, the state governments, the local government. But they were there waiting for their chance to come out of the woodwork. And they did. They came out of the woodwork. And we saw the consequences. Destruction. Everything. This was total destruction at every level. It wasn't a good thing that was accomplished here. Now imagine the same thing coming out of World Health Organization, which will be this kind of problem raised to the second or the third power. What will the effect be? Because now you can add to all of these narcissistic psychopaths at the domestic level, the narcissistic psychopaths who are looking for a one world government. I'm not so sure that Fauci was looking for one world government. I think he was perfectly happy just exercising his own power. But what if he were? Or what if someone in his position were also concerned with promoting one world government? Oh, well, they'd go along with the dictates coming out of the UN, the World Health Organization, international rules, regulations, committees. They'd go along with that at a moment's notice. And then what would happen to the vast majority of people trying to push back? Well, they wouldn't even know how to push back. Right? Just ask somebody that question. How do you push back against a dictate from the World Health Organization? What's the mechanism? Well, the mechanism would be our public health people say no. Nancy Reagan, just say no to drugs and alcohol, right? Well, this is a drug, international control. Just say no. What if they don't say no? Then what's the pushback from the average citizen who's now subject to these regulations, whatever they may be? Oh, the World Health Organization going to tell everyone that you have to have a monkeypox vaccination? Period? Has nothing to do with travel or work or school. You just have to have one? Because some other country has reported to the emergency committee or the compliance committee that the United States is not enforcing mandatory monkeypox vaccinations? Think about that one. Is that a possibility? Well, I don't know for monkeypox, right? But that's the disease du jour, right? But something. And World Health Organization Emergency Committee, Sri Lanka as a representative. Oh, the United States isn't enforcing this. And the people from the United States are traveling and their products are traveling all over the world, blah, 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 blah. And therefore, they have to have the same vaccination status as we have in Sri Lanka, whatever the country would be. And the World Health Organization Emergency Committee says, oh, yes, that's right. And under Article, whatever it would be, 12, Regulation 17A2, we are directing the public health officials in the United States to mandate monkeypox vaccinations. And they start doing it. All right, with the coercive authority of police agencies. Now what?
And the complicit media.
Well, of course, the media. The media's going to push this because they're going to whip up the fear. I mean, no one's going to go along with this unless they're terrified, right? So people are terrified. World Health Organization says, well, Sri Lanka has complained, and therefore this is dictate you have to do this because you're a party to our organizational structure, et cetera, and the World Health Organization sends dictates down to the FDA, CDC, or whomever, and says you have to do this, and those people say, yeah, well, we have to do this, so they come up with some kind of document, and all of a sudden at the state and local level where the people are doing the injections, there's a federal UKs, and it's going to be enforced by what? By the local police, I guess. National Guard, I don't know what, somebody, some coercive agent, somebody with a gun, or he's going to come to your door and say, we have a record here that you haven't had your monkeypox vaccination. And here's the candy striper with the needle, and you're going to get it. All right? Because some bureaucrat in Switzerland decided this was going to happen. And there's no recourse. Well, I guess there would be recourse. I mean, people could simply refuse to do it, and you'd have vast levels of social unrest, and who knows where that would lead. But in terms of the legal mechanism for stopping the thing before it gets to that point, you ask, well, where is it? Well, I mean, we still don't have judicial decisions about all these things that happened during the Fauci pandemic. The courts still haven't decided how much of that was legal and how much of it wasn't. For years and years and years. And then, of course, it's too late. People died in nursing homes. Well, you're not going to bring them back. right? All the economic destruction, all the social dislocation. People, we've created two classes of people in society who are at each other's throats: the people who have taken the vaccine and the people who haven't. Right? Another Marxist class struggle situation has been set up. That's why I say this is the problem. It should have been stopped at the beginning, but it wasn't. And now we have the Gordian knot. How do you unravel it? And the answer is, well, until Alexander the Great came along, no one knew how to unravel it. You see, they put us in this situation, and now they want to take it to the next level, of which you're not going to get to the Gordian knot. They're not going to give you the opportunity Alexander had to cut it with his sword. They're going to take it up to this higher level, so it's completely insulated from any control by a particular nation. Unless you want to create this international brouhaha of withdrawing your nation from the United Nations. They say. Now, it would be very nice if the courts, it would have to be the Supreme Court, would come along and say, oh, no, these public health people don't have this kind of authority. But they're apparently afraid to do that even at the Fauci level. And you got Fauci coming up and saying, as he did not too long ago, well, the courts have no business in this because we're the experts. All right? Now, I just want to point something out. That, I say that's baloney. If you have a case against Fauci as an individual, bureaucrat, or against the agency or what have you, and it's predicated upon the claim that these people or this agency has violated your constitutional rights, and the defense is, well, we did this pursuant to our expert opinion, etc. We looked at all this. That question, that factual question, is the basis for the entire case. And that's what the courts actually have to look at. That's what's called the constitutional fact, or the constitutional facts in plural, right? An agency comes along and says, we've made an expert determination and it's X, and on that basis, we're entitled to do something to this plaintiff that violated his whatever business relations or whatever, right? And we can do that. We have the authority to do that. The courts would say, well, we're going to look into these facts. We don't take you at your word. We don't back away because you apply a rubber stamp of expertise to the documents you've created. We get to look at it. And the plaintiff can bring his own experts in to challenge your experts. And we do that every day. Automobile accident cases, right? There's the experts for the insurance company that says it was the fault of the driver. There's the experts for the driver who says it wasn't my fault, it was the fault of the party who was insured. And so you have a conflict of the experts in the court. And they testify, and they bring forward their analyses and their documents, whatever the heck it is that they have, to try and justify their conclusions. And who makes the determination? Well, if it's a jury case, it's the jury. If it's a case tried before a judge, it's the judge. It's not the experts on either side that make the determination. All right? Happens in criminal cases all the time as well. Prosecutor brings in the experts. Oh, we've got the ballistics guys. Oh, we've got the medical examiner, et cetera, et cetera. Defendant comes in and says, well, I got ballistics people who will say the opposite. I've got medical people who will say that this autopsy wasn't conducted properly. Right? And then what happens? The jurors decide, or the judge decides, depending on how the case has been set up. There is never a situation, never with a capital N, in which expertise excludes court determination. Except where it becomes highly impractical, and this is the impracticality. As you move the levels of expertise higher and higher and higher in the system, right? Some expert, some local coroner, low-level expert is easier to deal with than someone like Fauci. And Fauci is easier to deal with than somebody off in Switzerland who's part of an international compliance committee. So you see the difficulty here, and of course this is the goal of the entire administrative state concept, which is to take all real power away from true government, that is the people themselves, and put it into institutions which are not subject to popular control. except through mechanisms which are not really controlling. I mean, we got Congress, but Congress doesn't control these agencies. Congress is certainly not going to be able to control the World Health Organization, right? So although there's an appearance of popular control because we still elect, or maybe we don't elect, we still vote. We don't know who elects them. We still elect these people to public office. They are nothing but shills. They're the cigar store Indian. Right? They're standing out front. They're doing nothing, and the real action is taking place in the back room. And it should have been stopped at the beginning. And as I say, I don't know how to stop this, quote unquote, legally, except ultimately to just back away from this United Nations entirely.
One of the things that people have been criticized for who raise concerns over this or many other topics is that people say, oh, you're arguing the slippery slope fallacy, as though in logic there is this idea that you can't say, well, A is wrong because it could lead to B, and we know B is wrong, so therefore A is wrong. And people say that's the slippery slope fallacy, where you can't claim that the current thing is wrong because it could lead to something worse that's not on the table right now. And yet we see this drumbeat of examples playing out through the decades and through the centuries that lead us down exactly in the direction that people were worried about, and it was foretold originally.
Well, in the first place, it's not a fallacy. It's not a logical fallacy. It's just a denial that A will lead to B. Because you can set up a situation, and a typical situation setup, where you say, here's how A will lead to B. If this happens, we'll get B. So there's no logical fallacy there at all. You may be able to contradict that series of steps and say, well, that third step never happens. Right? Factually, that can never happen. But logically, it's not a fallacy. And if you look historically, what's the evidence for the A leads to B? Well, we have it domestically. There's no question that the administrative state setup has led to this really destruction of popular control over government in any of those areas where administrative agencies function. There's no question that that's true. Congress doesn't control it. The courts don't control it. They're not elected. So what do we have? In fact, you'll find Supreme Court decisions where they talk about these things as the fourth branch of government. Well, now, when I look at the Constitution of the United States, I see three branches of government. Where'd the fourth one come from? All right? But they're even recognized. The courts say, well, we can't do anything. This is a fourth branch of government. It has all these powers and so on, and there's no way we can really control them. And they never come up with a conclusion, well, wait a minute, then there's something fundamentally wrong here. All right? So people who talk about that slippery slope logical fallacy don't know what the hell they're talking about. I may use French. Okay, that's just bunkum. You can see it right here. And the same thing is true incrementally already with the public health operation at the international level. How often did we hear during the Fauci pandemic propaganda onslaught of who was telling us? The World Health Organization was telling him, right? How often did we hear that? Was it a logical fallacy to say, well, I'm actually listening to who here? Is that a logical fallacy, or was it actually happening? It was actually happening. And Fauci was saying, well, we got to go along with the World Health Organization. Well, the World Health Organization has experts, blah, 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 simply to bolster what he wanted to do. And nobody said, well, wait a minute. The World Health Organization has no more credibility than you do. And it has no legal authority to control us, which you also don't have if we look at this carefully. Right? But what did everyone accept here? Oh, Fauci had this legal authority, and the people working under him or listening to him, and Fauci could take as some kind of gospel things coming out of the World Health Organization. Well, there's a slippery slope again. A has led to B, right? We set up a bunch of national public health bureaucrats, and then the United Nations sets up a group of international public health bureaucrats, and then we discover that the national public health bureaucrats call upon the internet, or they listen to, or they say somehow they should be influenced by or controlled by the international ones. That's A leading to B. It's right there in front of your nose. Now, the next step, of course, is to make these what I would call suggestions or guidelines coming out of WHO into directives or controls. And that's what's now going on. They're setting up the mechanism by which they can say, oh, this is not simply a matter of our giving you a suggestion, Mr. Fauci or whoever is in his position, but this is now a real, honest-to-gosh directive. This is something you have to do. We have something called the Compliance Committee, right? And the Emergency Committee, these are their terms, not mine. Well, what does that mean? Emergency Committee, we decide what the emergency is because we're the experts, right? And the Compliance Committee says, oh, well, you're not complying. And now you have to, and here's how you comply. And the representative from Tanzania, or wherever it is, who's on this committee, is complaining about you're not complying, and so we're telling you what you have to do, and everyone has to get the monkeypox shot. And you tell me why that couldn't happen. But all looking at this is, at what point do the international control elements in this structure, which they're trying to put in, now tell the local public health people, the Fauci types, here's what you have to do. And then Fauci comes along, or whoever it is, whatever that man's name is, comes along and says, well, that's what we have to do, and now all of you have to take the monkeypox shots. That's why I say anyone's looking at this and talks about slippery slopes has not been awake for the past 2 years. And he's never read any history about the administrative state.
Exactly. I mean, or longer, because we had President Eisenhower at his farewell address talking about beware the military-industrial complex. Then we got the military-agricultural complex, military-pharma complex, military-energy complex, and all of these specters that have been trotted out in the past several decades seem to be global in nature: public health emergencies, climate and environmental, terrorism. So go right ahead.
The Eisenhower thing always struck me as fascinating. Here was the fellow who was a 5-star general, right? Commander in the European theater in the war. What was he, head of the Joint Chiefs? Probably he was. I don't know. He was one of the highest ranking people. What was the other one? MacArthur, right? 5-star generals. All right. He becomes president. And on the day he leaves, or pretty close to the day he leaves, he gives this televised speech warning about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. What was he doing for the earlier 8 years? You get my point? Did he just figure that out on the day he was leaving office? Did he have... the angel Gabriel came down and announced this to him on that morning. And I got to put this in my speech, right? Because I've got a revelation from heaven. No, he was a top military man. He didn't know about the interrelationships between the military people, the Department of Defense that has been created, right? When they changed the structure, the Department of War, Department of Defense, the Pentagon, right? The huge corporations that were involved in producing war materials. He didn't know about any of that simply as someone who was in the Army at his level. He didn't know about that. He didn't know about that for the 8 years that he was president of the United States. And then he comes at the last day and says, well, you got to be worried about this. Yeah, we got to be worried about this because people like you, Eisenhower, did nothing about it. You let this happen. Now, this is exactly the point that we're talking about here. All of these things that we're worried about have been let happen by the political class. And it could be because some of them are out-and-out Marxists. They believe they want one world government, or socialist government. Ideologues, fuzzy-headed thinkers, right? Useful idiots. We can run down the whole list. Incompetence of one kind or another. But the fact of the matter, and some of them obviously are clued into what's happening, but they're in a very small minority, and so they really don't have any effect. So we look at the reason we have this problem is because we have had a dysfunctional political class in control of this country since Wilson, and maybe before Wilson, because the ideas, as I say, were not generated by Wilson. He just had the opportunity to put a lot of them into effect all at once. Right? And how long is that? Well, let's see, Wilson. When was Wilson? That was the First World War. So we're talking about, right, 1912. Right, that's when he was. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's 18 years. almost 120 years ago. If you turn of the century, which probably when these ideas were coming, a lot of them came in from Germany, from the Bismarck socialist type state, Bismarckian socialism, and centralized control and all this stuff, okay? Institutional economics, this kind of crap came in from Prussia to a large extent. And that's the turn of the 20th century, so let's say 1900. So we're talking about 120 years, 122 years. This has been going on. And by accretion, little, as they say, little cat's feet, right? The fog comes into Chicago on little cat's feet. Who wrote that? Carl Sandburg? I can't remember which poem, the name of the poem. Fog coming in on little cat's feet. And you think that's exactly what's happened. Piece by piece, slowly, but it was always sold, well, we need this. Right? Because in a complex society, we have to have expert inputs, and then expert suggestions, and then expert controls, and then experts providing penalties, right? It's always step by step by step by step by step. And this was done nationally first. And then they created, the internationalists created the institutions. First they created the League of Nations, which didn't really work. Then they created the United Nations. These institutions floating out there, freely floating in the globalist world, globalist atmosphere. And they're connected to the various countries through treaties.
In this environment, Dr. Vieira, I'm sorry, we only have about 5 minutes left. It sounds pretty bleak in terms of, I mean, you've got this juggernaut of this mega trend that's been going on for over a century to wrest autonomy and freedom away from people, first to their national governments and now to global unelected invisible administrators and so on. It leaves people scratching their heads and wondering, first of all, okay, if people come to the grasp this reality, they're still left wondering, what do we do about it as individuals? And I think you've said earlier, our avenues of recourse may not be as many as we think, but are there steps that you can identify that people can take if they want to minimize the impact of this on their personal lives? Well,
the difficulty with minimizing the impact on your personal life is to what extent are these public health dictates going to impinge, or interfere, right? And you've seen that it's very difficult to get away from them. I mean, in this country, I mean, I suppose there are a lot of people that have not gone to the extent of being treated with these so-called vaccines, but huge numbers of people have. Why? Because they created a situation where you couldn't work, you couldn't travel, whatever it was. The various things that you needed to do or very much wanted to do. And they said, well, you're not going to be allowed to do this anymore unless you accede to these medical experiments, unless you become an experimental animal. And that's the thing that really worries me, that why people would have said, oh, yes, it's more important to me to go to a Knicks game. It's more important to me to eat out at this French restaurant than it is to be made an experimental animal in some kind of medical program, quasi-medical program. And by doing that, to become a cog in that system, because now my participation in that system is validating that system. So that's why I go back to Nancy Reagan, just say no, right? Just say no to drugs and alcohol. Yeah, but it's very difficult to say, just say no, when all of your peers are snorting cocaine, right? You want to be in part of that crowd. And then, of course, once you've done it, now you've validated the whole drug scene, as it were, right? Or alcohol, whatever it is, improper behaviors, self-destructive behaviors. And so there's the real problem. It would be one thing if you had a vast majority of people in the country who had said, a working majority, doesn't have to be vast, a working majority of people in the country said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let you play Dr. Mengele with us. No. But that didn't happen. And see, all this talking about democracy is basically nonsense. Democracy is a bad system anyway. Why should 51% of the people control 49% of the people? Right? No. But if you look at it from the point of view of the majority is going to do the right thing, that's what we're hoping. The majority will want constitutional government. The majority will want controls of one kind or another on the excesses of government. Yeah, okay. Well, what has been proven is democracy doesn't work. If you claim this is a democracy simply because people get to vote, look at what's happened under this democracy. The worst of all possible worlds. Well, now what? See, this is where it becomes very interesting, because as soon as you start saying, well, democratic systems don't work, constitutional government that is based at some level upon the exercise of democracy doesn't work. It's not that it couldn't work, but it doesn't work. It's a theoretical concept, but we haven't made it work. Now what? How do you go back to it? Right? The way you would go back to it is through the exercise of the democratic system within it. Right? This is the people that say, oh, we have to elect different politicians. Well, that makes no difference if the politicians are all selected by cabals in the back room of these two political parties, which are actually one political party. It's a farce, right? So there's your first problem. Can you return to a democratic constitutional government through the mechanisms of that democratic constitutional government when those mechanisms have been totally corrupted? Okay? And then if you're not going to go that way, if you look at it, well, that's an impossibility, then what's your other alternative? For those people who want to talk about slippery slopes, what's your other alternative? If you can't go through the mechanism of democratic constitutional government, what is the mechanism you will choose? And that's why I look at this and I say, oh my goodness, we are in big trouble. Because if you can't get people in a very short length of time, because take this World Health Organization initiative, they are working on this right now. They're not talking about something 10 years from now, 15 years from now. They're working on getting these new regulations into place right now, and then, of course, they will go from there step by step to advance that particular agenda. So you don't have a great deal of time to deal with this. And I look at people who say, oh, well, we just got to go. It's the next election that counts, right? We've got to get, because you've been talking about the next election my entire lifetime. All right? And my lifetime, a long lifetime right now. I wasn't born 5 years ago. And it hasn't happened. In fact, it's gotten worse. And this is, what was it, Einstein's, they attribute this to Einstein. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. Right? So are we talking about a society that is clinically insane from the political point of view? Now, see, that makes it even worse, because if you have the alternative, say, well, democratic government doesn't work, maybe we're going to think of an alternative, but if you're clinically insane, you're never going to pick an alternative that will work, right? I shouldn't be laughing about this, but it really is the irony of it. But I think this is the key, because they have shown with the pandemic operation that they ran, exactly what they want to do and exactly what they think they can get away with and exactly what they have gotten away with to a very large extent. And if that doesn't wake people up, what is going to? Right.
You've got to surrender your bodily autonomy, surrender your civil and political freedom, surrender your social and mobility, surrender all of the rights you had under the Constitution willingly and voluntarily, because it's for your own good. You'll thank me later, based on all this serious fear-related stuff that we're informing you of, and that's why you should do it voluntarily.
And it's all interlocked, because if you surrender your bodily autonomy, it's because you have surrendered your legal rights. It's because you have surrendered ultimately popular sovereignty. All these things, you can look at this chain and say that last step, when they stick the needle in your arm, is a result of all of these other things you've let them do. This is the culmination of it. And so one would think, well, now we have to work back from that. We have to say we're not going to accept this, and we're not going to accept the things that have led to this. But then we get back to the problem of, well, that has to be done by a certain percentage of the population. Right? It can't just be a few people talking as we're talking now and commiserating about how bad this is. It has to be a real groundswell of resistance. And are you looking at that? I'm not. I don't see it.
Yeah, it's disturbing how much, even with the revelations coming out, that these pronouncements about safe and effective were based on quote unquote hope. That word came directly from some of the regulators in the officialdom. That people who were divided into basically two factions in our country and went along with that wholeheartedly are now not rising up in indignance and rebelling against that and say, throw these people out, and how did this make sure, what do we need to do to make sure that this never happens again, but just going along, now we're on to the next thing. It's gravely concerning.
Yeah, and unless you remove the scenario, the play will be repeated over and over again. And I think that's what people don't understand. A lot of people say, "Oh, thank goodness that we're getting out of this pandemic." And I say, "You're not getting out of the pandemic. You're still in this cage they put you in, this cage of controls." The pandemic was one example of what they're going to do, of what they did do, and it exemplifies what they will do. And that's people don't want to face that. They don't want, once they get out from under this problem, they say, thank goodness. And they don't want to face the reality that, wait a minute, this isn't the end.
And that's right. One of the examples you've given us is people need to be able to speak up and speak out. We're trying to do that here. This interview between the two of us will be watched by thousands, and they can share it widely, and that helps to advance the discussion. And another thing that happens is people need to stand up and opt out and say, I and we. As for me and my house, me and my union, me and my coworkers, the whole department, we spoke with a manager of a nursing department. We spoke with, and she said, if they put this mandate through in her particular hospital, they're going to lose more than half their department overnight because we're just going to walk out. So all the senior people. So people need to get organized and take collective action because it does make a bigger impact than individually. Do you see any fruit coming from contacting senators, representatives, governors, et cetera, and say resist this?
Well, I think the more pressure, and we're talking now, freedom of petition, right? Bringing to bear on these people, one, it will have an educational effect, because maybe some of them really don't know how bad this has been. They just aren't aware of it. And then number two, it will make them aware that there are, we would hope, large numbers of people in their constituency, so that their own political fortunes will depend upon whether they will take the right step or whether they be voted out of office. And then, of course, some of them may be in positions actually to do something. If you're talking about, I don't think running to the President of the United States gets you anywhere. But if you go to a governor in some states, in that capacity, he may be able to, pass on to other people within the government, the executive branch, some, let's not call them directives, but suggestions as to ways in which they could move. And I think that would be one key, that you have 50 states. You have the possibility of perhaps convincing some of the people in the executive branch of those states to stand up. Certainly some of these public health mandates that come out. I mean, that's the just say no. No, we're not going to have somebody from Washington who is not a licensed doctor tell our local doctors and their patients what medicines they will or will not take. Instead of saying, use what you think is going to help your patient, and we'll cover for you.
Yep. And that kind of local return to the principles that are valid of subsidiarity, local decision, client-doctor privilege, et cetera, that sort of thing, is one good avenue. We should dedicate our next interview, if we can, to those kind of local actions that we can take as individuals, as groups, and encourage our local representatives, our local executives, et cetera, to enact so that we can protect ourselves at the local level. We've been speaking with Dr. Edwin Vieira, constitutional attorney. Dr. Vieira, I always want to ask you at the end of each interview how people can read more of your work, because a lot of people are meeting you for the first time in this interview, and they're really wanting to hear more.
Well, if they go to a website called newswithviews.com, one word, newswithviews.com, and there's a writer link. Go to that. That'll take you to me somehow. Scroll down, you'll find me. And then you'll get a long list of articles that I've published there since when? 2005, I think. Been a long time. On these types of topics that we talk about.
Well, we're always grateful for your presence here. We never seem to have enough time, but that's probably because you bring such a wealth of background and the basic principles that are involved that people don't even think about. We don't get time to think about those things clearly. Those we hear speaking on the news are people who are in decision-making roles in government certainly don't seem to be clarifying things as lucidly as you do when you're here. So we're always grateful for your presence, and just thank you for joining us again on Liberty and Finance.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.